And I think we can get started. Hello and welcome to this evening's webinar, From IEP to Adult Life, What Makes a Difference in Planning. I'm Jane Hauser. I'm NESCA's Director of Marketing and Outreach, and I'm joined by Kelley Challen, NESCA's Director of Transition Services. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And Kelley will be guiding you through the presentation this evening. And just to let everybody know, we will be doing a live Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So we've enabled the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And you can feel free to add any questions in there, but we will be getting to them at the end. And there's also a chat feature. If anybody's running into technical difficulties or has any other questions, please feel free to use that. And if you don't, if you miss something throughout the presentation, don't worry, we will be putting this on our website under the resources section as well in the coming days. So with that, I will turn things over to Kelley Challen, and she'll introduce herself and jump right in. Thank you.
Good evening. As Jane said, I'm Kelley Challen. I'm the Director of Transition Services here at NESCA. So I oversee our consultation, planning, and assessment services. If you're unfamiliar with NESCA, I just want to take a moment to talk about our practice. NESCA stands for Neuropsychology and Education Services for Children and Adolescents. We're a group practice with offices in Newton and Plainville, Massachusetts, as well as Londonderry, New Hampshire. And we specialize in assessment, treatment, and consultation services for children, adolescents, and young adults with special needs, whether mild or complex. Our clinical staff is comprised of 11 expert neuropsychologists and 5 transition specialists who have a mix of backgrounds in school and guidance counseling, occupational therapy, and vocational rehab counseling, as well as other therapists and psychoeducational counselors, treatment providers, including occupational therapists and speech language pathologists, and consultants. NESCA was founded in 2007 as a neuropsychology practice, but we've had transition specialists on staff and offered transition services since 2009, essentially since the beginning of the practice. This means that thinking about transition planning is ingrained into our practice, and each of our clinicians aims to provide thorough and accurate testing that can support a family and team in creating a roadmap for helping a child progress toward adult life. So that's a lot of information about NESCA and about me. And before moving forward, I'd like to just pause for a moment and ask that participants just type into the chat and let me know if you're a parent or an educator or another professional, and how old your child is or how old the students are that you tend to work with. This just gives me a little bit of information for when I'm sharing any sort of examples while I'm speaking. And I'm going to keep moving, but anybody who can type in here and just let me know sort of who you are, that's very helpful. So the agenda for tonight is that we're going to talk about what transition is and go through some definitions of transition, touch upon why transition planning should begin early, and then spend most of our time discussing skills and factors that make a difference in successful transition planning. And I'm hoping to leave about 10 minutes for questions at the end of the talk. I do want to say, we talk about transition planning early. It's never too late to start transition planning either. And so if you're a parent of an older teenager or a parent of a child 18 to 22, or a professional working with students in those age ranges, there's always things to work on, sort of no matter where you're starting from. So transition, what is it? It's a word that we hear a lot about, but what does it mean? We could certainly look at the Merriam-Webster definition. Or we could consider this definition that comes from Andrew Halpern, which says that transition refers to a change in status from behaving primarily as a student and assuming emerging adult roles in the community. And I think really our young adults these days, these sort of emerging adult roles may hit at different times. But for students on an IEP in the United States, transition has additional implications. So transition services are a legal term and a concept defined in federal law. IDEA 2004 is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and this is the law that governs special education services in the United States. IDEA 2004 requires that no later than the age of 16 or 14 in Massachusetts, a student's IEP must include appropriate measurable post-secondary goals, so post-high school goals, based on age-appropriate transition assessments related to training, education, employment, and where appropriate, independent living skills. And it also has to include transition services, including courses of study, so including the courses the student's going to take, that are needed to assist the child in reaching their goals. And those transition services are also defined in IDEA. And transition services are a coordinated set of activities, so they have to be organized together. And they're designed to be within a results-oriented process focused on improving academic and functional achievement of the child with a disability to facilitate child's movement from school to post-school activities, including post-secondary education, vocational education, integrated employment, so included employment, right, in the community, even with support, continuing and adult education, adult human services, independent living, or community participation. In Massachusetts, community participation is a requirement. And transition services are based on the individual child's needs while taking into account the child's strengths, preferences, and interests. And they can include instruction, specialized or generalized instruction, related services, community experiences, and the development of employment and other post-school adult living objectives. And if appropriate, also acquisition of daily living skills and functional vocational evaluation. So these are a few things that we focus on within and outside the process. And this is sort of the idea of simplifying that language. So we're focused on strengths and preferences and interests and needs. We expect that the student will be a participant in the process, that transition assessment will happen. In Massachusetts, that a transition planning form will be used for the student, and that there will be measurable post-secondary goals, that our whole IEP process is going to be moving toward goals for the student after they exit public education. Those goals are going to be in the areas of post-secondary education, employment, independent living, and community involvement. And there's 4 concepts that we really focus on. We're vision-driven. We're sort of moving toward the goals, the dreams. It's results-oriented. We're looking for tangible, measurable kinds of results. It's a coordinated process, and the students being supported in academics and functional skill development. So what does transition planning look like? IEP transition planning is a cyclical process. It's how we engage the student and empower the student. Certainly goal setting or visioning is about how you identify and write the goals for the student. And it should always be informed by some type of assessment. And then once we have goals, we create an action plan for progressing towards those goals. We execute our plan, and then we evaluate the progress we've made and adjust the plan or adjust the goals depending on where we're at. And then we rinse and repeat, right? We sort of continue going through this process. I mean, often throughout our entire lifespan, right? But certainly as part of this IEP process. Transition planning, though, is also a mindset. It goes way beyond special education. It really requires us to be optimistic, to aim high. It requires a lot of creativity, thinking outside the box. And it requires a lot of flexibility, being able to adjust and shift plans. Certainly, if we think about having gone through and still in some ways going through a pandemic, when we were all planning for our children 5 years ago, I don't think anybody expected to be where we are right now, and we needed to be flexible and think about other ways to plan. And certainly there are different jobs and different ways of learning that students have access now that they didn't have access to 5 years ago. And then there are other things that may have been cut off or shifted, and we've had to really sort of move and adjust. Certainly we need a steady pace. You have to keep moving. Even if you hit a setback, we sort of keep moving slowly, steadily. And we need a village. You really need a good number of people who are care for and are committed to the student, the child, in order to be most successful with this process. So have you started planning for adulthood? Have you started transition planning? Absolutely, of course. It's something that starts at birth, really. Every time we make a conscious decision to teach our child a skill, we're planning, we're transition planning, right? If we're lucky, there's also times that maybe young people assert that they want to do something on their own. And when we let them do that, that's another way that we're planning for the future. I know I'm the parent of 5 and 9-year-old boys, and so it certainly can be a struggle to get them to build independence, either because I don't want to take the time or clean up the mess, or, or sometimes because kids get sort of dependent on their parents for different things. So you have to be planful, you have to be thoughtful and take the opportunities that you have. I love going to supermarkets that have, shopping carts that are child size so that we can practice what it's going to be like to shop in adulthood. And that's everything from how a supermarket's laid out to, how to carry certain items, how to stop, put them in the cart, load them into bags and things like that. There's so many different skills involved in any sort of activity that we have to carry out in our daily lives. So why begin early? Why sort of be focused on actually planning for the future? There are a lot of different reasons to think about this. Certainly planning for a smooth transition takes time for all students, but it takes even more time for students with disabilities. And there are often fewer opportunities for students with disabilities with special needs to learn adulting skills. Sometimes their schedules are overly full, have extra therapies or pulled out for different tutoring or things like that. And so they may have fewer opportunities to be building life skills, community skills, social skills. And we have to prioritize one skill at a time. We definitely need to practice as many times as we can. And the practice needs to sort of move locations. It's not enough to just be practicing things in a classroom or in our house. We have to take things elsewhere. And at NESCA, we often talk about also like building skills until automaticity, right? So practicing a skill so many times that it's really not taking very much brain power to be able to carry out the task. Certainly transitioning from high school to adult life increases stress and anxiety and novelty. And so we want to have taught enough skills and have those skills be so automatic that when we add additional stressors like taking a college class or showing up for the first day of work or work training, we can carry out some of our other automatic tasks and not be so distressed. Also, our kids really do need more explicit instruction, and we might realize that we need to teach something that we thought was already understood or learned. So the more time we leave for planning, the more time there is to discover that we need to teach something we might not have realized we needed to teach. And we really want to set a tone and growth mindset as early as we can, right? The idea that we're all building skills, that this is going to take time, that there will be mistakes or failures, and that this is all part of growing. And then also thinking about the fact that financial and legal planning take time too. Why else is transition planning important? Well, what we know from longitudinal studies is that during high school, youth on IEPs are less likely to take college placement tests or to be expected to attend college or live on their own. They're less likely to have paid work outside of school, so to have a paid, part-time job or summer job, less likely to then, which makes them less likely to then work for pay in adulthood. And despite the legal right for transition planning in the United States, youth with disabilities are less likely to talk with staff at school about their transition plans. So we actually talk to students with special needs less about what their plans for the future are, even though legally we're supposed to be doing that more. What else do we know after high school? And I should say this data comes from the National Longitudinal Transition Study, the second one that was done. And so it's a 10-year study of students on IEPs transitioning into adulthood. And from this study, we learned that students with who had been on IEPs were more likely to attend a 2-year college, but less likely to attend and complete a 4-year college program. They earn an average of $1 less per hour. They were less likely to live independently. They were also less likely to have a checking account or a credit card. Some other statistics from other studies, we know that 76% of adults with developmental disabilities are still, living at home with families. And that nationwide 25% of caregivers are 60 and older. And so what we know is we're not being as successful with transitioning to adulthood as I think any of us would want for our children or for the students that we're working with. So what makes a difference in transition planning? What makes a difference as a student goes from being a student to being a young adult and taking on some of these young adult roles in the community? If we're going to put time and energy into skill building, what makes the biggest difference? There are 6 skills that have been highlighted as the most impactful for success and satisfaction in adulthood from research. And these are self-awareness, goal setting, use of available resources, emotional coping strategies, and self-determination. Self-awareness, certainly means that young people need to be able to report accurate information regarding their disabilities and to express the types of accommodations that they need for success and to explain the special ed services that they have received or the supports that have been helpful to them to other people. Disability awareness is a big piece of self-awareness, but also students need to just be aware of their basic strengths and limitations. They need to be knowledgeable about what they're good at and use their knowledge of their strengths to guide their decision-making, to guide those goals that they're setting. Certainly at NESCA, we conduct a high number of transition assessments, and something that's not uncommon for students at any age is to be aware of some of their strengths and challenges, but to have college goals or career goals that don't fully align with their strengths and challenges. And, that could be sort of the student hasn't had the opportunity, number one, to really even compare and think about, let's say wanting to be a pilot, but having terrible night vision, or having issues with attention that would prevent them from being able to become a pilot. So it's really critical that students have the opportunity to have a planning process where they get to learn things for themselves, and we don't just sort of tell them that the career goal doesn't match up with their strengths and interests and needs, but we set up learning and exploration activities for students to learn more about themselves, learn more about their areas of interest, and build some of those skills for comparing things and setting more appropriate goals independently or more independently. There are a number of different aspects of self-awareness when we're thinking about how to build skills. And any one of these could be a starting point for self-exploration. Sometimes things you don't like is the easiest thing for a young person to talk about, right? They can make a list of 25 things they don't like or they don't want in adult life, even though they might not be able to visualize goals for 10 years from now, but they could, visualize all the things they don't want. Then sometimes there are students who can think about things that they like or enjoy doing, or and you can even then compare and contrast those things, start to sort of rate things on a scale and try to figure out where the favorites are if those are hard things for a student to name. Other things to think about, personality characteristics, things that are challenging or take more work or take more effort, knowing who the people are who help you to overcome challenges, knowing what the supports are that help you to overcome challenges, noticing, which classes you learn best in and what about the teacher, works for you or doesn't work for you. There's so many different ways to sort of dig in and start building some of this awareness. And certainly disclosure is an important aspect of self-awareness. Some things to consider related to disability disclosure include that there is absolutely no magic age. Some students are very ready to learn lots of information young. Some students, it's a little bit later. You really have to understand the individual and their development and their readiness for learning different things. And there's a big difference between disclosing a diagnostic label versus disclosing descriptive information. And the truth is, certainly in adulthood, young people need to be able to do both of those things. You need to know the diagnostic labels because those are absolutely necessary for accessing accommodations. And at the same time, it's so much more important to be able to describe how diagnosis impacts access to something and what the accommodations are that help to basically lessen the impact of the diagnosis. So there's a lot you could do to teach about the descriptive info if you're sort of not ready to be working on diagnostic label, but the reality is that those diagnoses do matter. And we need to be teaching young people that disability is not, it's not a dirty word. It's a way to access things that you're entitled to when you have a good understanding of that information. Certainly disclosure is a process. It's not something that happens just one time and it's over. There are disclosures that happen in many different places to many different people, disclosures with the same person repeatedly, learning different aspects. And so that's important to be aware of. And you could do things like discussing, brain development and function, or, make it really scientific. It's very important to be honest and ask other people to give honest feedback, and not to tell a student that they're really good in an academic area that they're not good at. You can share with a student that they've done something that's a really strong performance for them or a really strong performance in comparison to other things, without giving false sense of self or false sense of expectations. Here's some other ways to consider talking about learning about disability and self. Certainly thinking about learning style or multiple intelligences, interpersonal and organizational styles. I like being able to relate and compare, characteristics of a young person with favorite TV characters or favorite book characters or other family members. Again, sort of comparing and contrasting and just sort of starting to appreciate different aspects. Certainly, we all divide labor up in our households different ways. And you can focus on sort of why it's done that way. Sometimes one person's more thorough at doing the dishes, but one person's quicker at doing the dishes. And there may be days that, we choose the quicker person, and there's days we choose the more thorough person. And just being able to talk about differences and how those impact, doing different tasks and things like that is really critical. I also think it's very important for students, for young people, to be involved in feedback discussions with any evaluator who has evaluated them, whether it's a psychologist or counselor, occupational therapist, sort of anytime a student's gone through a testing process and there's information to be learned and there are recommendations being made based on that information, it's really important for the student to have the opportunity in a developmentally appropriate way to sit with that clinician, learn the information, be able to ask questions, be able to participate in discussions that come out of whatever recommendations come out of the testing. In addition to self-awareness, goal setting is also a critical transition skill. Students need to be able to name a specific and realistic career goal, not just career goal, all kinds of goals, to conceive ways to measure the goals, to determine strategies and step-by-step processes that are necessary for achieving the goals, to develop a timeline, to sort of break down, chunk out a timeline for achieving the goal and for achieving those many steps, to take steps toward completing the goal, to assess their progress and how they're doing at completing things, and then to make adjustments as needed. Participating in systematic learning of goal setting and attainment is really critical. And it's important to understand that students also understand the importance of setting and striving for goals. Goal setting is not just about, annual goals for IEPs. It's also something that can be learned at home through plenty of activities. So things like setting a goal when you're reading a chapter book or even a shorter book, completing an art project and, setting different goals around that, planning a party or a trip or a meal, preparing a family meal. Saving allowance, saving up for something specific, writing thank you notes, remembering medications. There's so many different activities where we can set a goal and break that down and work on achieving a goal. Let a young person choose what they want to be, what do they want to be sort of in charge of and use for practicing this skill set. Perseverance is really important. It requires knowing when to back up and change course and ask for help. It's persistence to a point, right? being able to continue persisting, you know, not not overly, but being able to work towards a goal until it's accomplished or until it's really clear that adjustments need to be made in the plan. Requires flexibility and adaptability, and being able to adopt new strategies and, again, sort of redefine the goals. There's some plan A, plan B thinking that goes with this too, right? You know, if A doesn't work, I can try other things. And it does require, you know, learning from failures and being able to sort of like push even further. Certainly, perseverance can develop through other people explicitly modeling grit. It's something you can practice with support, right? Having encouragement and cheerleading until the point that you can sort of self-talk your own cheerleading. Being able to, you know, make a logical connection between your actions and consequences and motivators and consequences. Certainly students have to be able to believe that they can achieve success and have other people around them support that belief in order to persevere. And certainly students need to have experiences with risk taking. I was reading it's just an article online today about different adulting skills that are important for transition from high school to post-secondary life. And at the very end of the article, you know, the author just said, you have to let them take risks. You know, it's sort of like, no matter what skills we're developing, we have to allow students to try new things that they may fail at, and to fail sometimes. And that's really the only way to develop coping skills, which we'll talk about later, but this perseverance. You know, if you never struggle, how can you persevere? And when we constantly over-accommodate, when we put too many accommodations in an IEP, when we over-accommodate at home, when we knock down barriers and challenges, or we really enable students to avoid taking risks and to avoid failure, you know, we could be part of the problem in terms of preventing students from learning perseverance. Use of available resources has to do with the presence and use of effective support systems across different environments. And it certainly requires the self-awareness of your needs. So that's where you have to be sort of aware of your challenges or aware of your needs in a current moment. But it also requires knowing the help that's available, the resources that are available in a setting, and being able to ask for the right kind of help. So it's not just being given access, but rather, you know, seeking access and support appropriately. And it certainly can be helpful when individuals supported by individuals who have a sense of realism. If we think about a student who is heading off to a college setting after high school, the way that they might be using available resources would be to maintain a friend, you know, from high school to college so that they still have support from a friendship, successfully participating in small groups on campus to complete projects, successfully participating in a club or community organization, successfully interacting with some of the peers and dorm, with teachers, with the residential assistant, with other adults, you know, also understanding what different offices are on campus and what supports are available. And there are similar ways that a student might need to maintain and learn more about resources in an employment setting or in a vocational training environment. And it certainly builds upon self-awareness and self-advocacy. Students also need to develop effective means of reducing and coping with stress and frustration and other emotional aspects of everyday life and of having a neurodiverse profile. So just like goal setting and like I mentioned before, coping strategies develop when students are allowed to take risks. So there are different, you know, coping strategies, self-regulation. Self-regulation is actually, it's an executive functioning skill. And what we know about building some of these skills is that it's both having a strategy and sort of like learning different coping skills, learning different coping strategies, but also having opportunities to practice those coping strategies. These skills don't become concrete, you know, don't become useful until you've had enough opportunities to practice using them. And so again, that's where having stress, but also practicing your coping while you're having stress is really important. I feel like if students are accessing counseling, whether that's counseling at school or counseling in a private setting, students can't only be working on practicing coping strategies, practicing cognitive behavioral strategies, practicing whatever's working for them in a therapy setting, one-on-one with a therapist sitting in an office. You really have to practice these strategies in the situations that are stressful, in the environments. So this is just such a critical skill to be building, and we have to really be paying attention to make sure that we're doing that effectively. And certainly, students, may have other different kinds of things, even if it's your strategy is calling a parent or whatever. There's a lot of different coping strategies that can be effective for students. So we want to make sure that they have a wide variety of those before heading off into adult life. And the last skill that I want to talk about is self-determination. It's the last that I'm going to mention before some other things, but it's also the most important. It builds from many of the other described skills. And this slide includes two definitions of self-determination that both come from fact sheets that are put together by the Division on Career Development and Transition from the Council for Exceptional Children. The first is the most current, but I like them both. So one definition is the ability to make choices, solve problems, set goals, evaluate options, take initiative to reach one's goals, and accept consequences of one's actions. And you could see how that sort of incorporates all the skills that we've been talking about. But I also really like the second definition. It's pretty simple. It's just essentially being able to make choices and decisions about one's life without any more support than is necessary. And certainly I think can be tricky when we're talking about adulthood with youth, because we have a tendency to talk about independence, right? Independent skills. But nobody is fully independent in adult life. We're interdependent. And certainly that use of resources is important, right? Knowing who you can call for help and when you need to call them is important. So I think we need to often reframe the words that we're using to make sure that we are setting the expectation that everybody needs help in adult life. Research has indicated that individuals who have higher levels of self-determination have better employment outcomes, including higher wages. It also indicates that individuals who have higher levels of self-determination have better quality of life, which includes independence, productivity, community integration, and satisfaction. And interestingly, there are positives for students while they're in school when we are offering them more opportunities for self-determination, in that those students have more positive school experiences, higher grades, better attendance, and fewer behavior problems. Self-determination develops with frequent opportunities to make choices, engage in problem solving, and set goals, and also active involvement in the IEP development and implementation. When we keep students away from IEP meetings, we're delaying students being able to advocate for themselves in meaningful ways in adult life. And certainly if an IEP team has dynamics that are preventing students from being part of the team, then we're really not accomplishing what we've set out to do with special education for students. We need to address challenges and we need to figure out a way for the student to be the most involved person in any of those processes. In addition to those 6 skills, I do want to mention that employment is also a predictor of success in college and adult life. Certainly, during high school, there's employment behaviors that relate to post-high school employment and education success, things like expressing the desire for a job that matches one's career interests. So again, that comes back to self-awareness and being aware of different resources and opportunities. And demonstrating job readiness, such as being on time, completing work that's assigned, working cooperatively, successfully participating in a career technology or job training program, is an important, it sort of relates to post-high school employment, but that's something that not all students have the opportunity to do. And then obtaining a paid job. I can't say enough about how critical it is for students to have paid opportunities for work when they're in high school, and not just be lifelong students. And we're sort of living in a really exciting time right now because there's a labor shortage, and there's a labor shortage of a lot of jobs that a lot of different kind of individuals can do pretty well. And students who are out doing various kinds of employment are actually less likely to be fired right now, which is phenomenal because they have more opportunity for efficacy in the workplace, more opportunity to make more money. So I really cannot encourage enough seeking out employment while in high school. These are just some of the soft skills that also relate to being ready for employment in the long term. All right, so I've shared some ways to work on these skills, but there are a few other points that I would like to make. Certainly vision drives everything for the student, and we've talked about this a lot. Creating a narrative of expectation and possibility. Again, setting the bar high, setting the goals high, referring to the vision for the future often. Also being willing to have it change and become more the student's vision and less the parents' or the team's vision, and keeping things strengths-based as much as possible. Really trying to be accurately positive about expectations for the future. This is a graphic organizer that I sort of put together in terms of how to break out a vision for the future and some different components that we can be working with students on. So, where the student lives, what kinds of relationships they want to have, things they might do for fun independently and in the community, where and how they will learn, how they'll get around, and work that they want to have in the long term. And certainly a young person may not be able to fill this in completely the first time that they see it, but they might be able to fill in one piece, and being able to fill in that one piece might give them motivation to build different skills or do something different. And that's exciting. And sometimes it's, again, it's what I don't want, right? I don't want to live in my parents' basement. So here's some of the things I need to do to be able to achieve that. As I mentioned, IEP participation is critical, and that's something that can start at home. Again, different language around self-awareness, giving opportunities for choice making and setting small goals and carrying those goals out. It's an excellent means for students to become more aware of their strengths and weaknesses and why they have accommodations and modifications. And I think, various educators are becoming more familiar with students being really actively involved in their IEPs, but this is something that we often have to support for students, and we may need to be changing mindsets, changing expectations. This slide just kind of walks through a step-by-step way to include students in an IEP process. So certainly making sure that students are aware of their rights and what the process looks like. Students being able to be present at a meeting, at least for part of the meeting. Having the opportunity to really review the IEP with a parent or professional, or reviewing the proposed IEP. Preparing a script for a meeting to be able to come in and talk. Maybe giving a PowerPoint presentation or a brochure. And then in the long term, the goal is for a student to be able to really lead a team meeting. I love when there are opportunities for a student to be actively involved in, say, writing, one goal and helping to progress monitor for one goal, perhaps before being involved in trying to write the entire IEP. But there are a lot of different ways to do this. And this is a resource that comes from imdetermined.org. The link's on the side. I'm not sure if you can see it clearly, but it's a great website that has a lot of different materials for involving students in the IEP process. There are sort of simplified versions of IEPs that include the components that are required in every state. There are, this is a brochure that has different ways that a student can participate before, during, and after a meeting. There are other self-assessments to see how students are doing with their self-determination skills for participating in meetings. There's just a lot of great resources on this site. And then, beyond IEP engagement, we really need to be thinking about how to minimize accommodations. Certainly, certainly I do a lot of accommodating in my household, whether it's just accommodating tone of voice or, helping with things because, again, wanting to rush through the day or other things. So really thinking about where we're making human accommodations that are not going to be the kinds of human accommodations that would be made in other settings is critical. And we need to do that at home and at school and just sort of within the expectations that we have for young people. Obviously, and unfortunately, we often need to be eliminating one-to-one aid support. And that can be really difficult because often that's something that may have taken a long time to put in place for a student. And then almost as soon as they're gaining that one-to-one support in order to be able to build skills, we need to be thinking about how to have that young person be able to function at most with a 1-to-4 or 1-to-5 ratio in adult life. If a student wants to be integrated in employment or having the opportunity to go out on community leisure kinds of activities, they really need to be able to function with a much lower level of support than 1-to-1. And then students heading off to employment settings or college settings. I mean, in college, there is not 1-to-1 support. In employment, if there is, it's a very, very short-lived sort of experience. But really, to be able to be integrated in the community, you have to be able to function much more independently than that 1-to-1 ratio. Also making sure that we're pacing ourselves, looking at sort of things that we're doing today to accommodate and how to sort of reduce some of those over time. And we certainly don't want to be writing in accommodations to IEPs that are not really accommodations, right? If what we've written in is actually preventing a student from developing a skill, that needs to be paid attention to. And I would really encourage you to think about, something different that you could just do, maybe not today or tonight, maybe tomorrow. But really thinking about, before you step in, before you offer an accommodation, where there might be an opportunity for a student to do something on, for themselves without that level of support. Might be just learning to set an alarm, not even just an alarm for waking up, but an alarm for a reminder or a cue that someone else isn't giving them. Stopping doing laundry for a student who knows how to do that, or, sort of reducing the times that we're stepping in and doing chores for a young person. And then I've already talked about this a little bit, but remembering the importance of automaticity. So making sure that skills are being developed to the point that they can be done without occupying the mind with the low-level details required, and allowing it to become an automatic response pattern or habit. And it's certainly the result of learning and repetition and a lot of practice. Once a skill becomes automatic, we need to think about taking it to a new place or a new level. So if I can do laundry at home, can I do it at somebody else's home or at a laundromat or grandma's house? If there are certain, if I know how to order at Dunkin' Donuts, can I also order at Honeydew Donuts or Bruegger's Bagel or, a smaller bakery? Like just making sure that skills that are learned can be carried out in a lot of environments. I think one of the hardest skills for me personally at this point in my life is using card readers at stores, right? Especially if a store that I've frequented for a while changes out their card reader. And I think many people, not just our students with disabilities, but like all people, are going to end up often relying on debit and credit cards for making purchases as opposed to cash. Although I will say that using cash is a good way to gain money sense. But if you're going to be using cards for paying for things, practicing with a whole bunch of different card readers can really be an important skill. So just thinking about, how to practice things across settings, and again, not just in a classroom. And then certainly building a lasting team. So when we're thinking about, special education teams, there are certain people who are required to be there. For creative transition planning, a lot of times we want to bring more people into the team who maybe aren't as familiar with special education, who can ask, ask questions about why we're doing things certain ways, or may have ideas for other ways that we can support the young person, get them out into the community, get them out into different activities. And then over the long term, we really want to be building a team and a community around the young person. So that can be, not just family, but also neighbors, community members, mentors, other professionals, faith community, sitters and tutors, classmates or former classmates. Certainly bringing in adult human service providers when that's appropriate, but also coaches or troop leaders or other people in the community. And I think that, I apologize, there's some loud noise in the background. But certainly one of the things that I will talk about for students who have more limited verbal communication or more limited ability to self-advocate for themselves, those are the young people where I will talk with families about really making sure that that young person is the mayor of their community, making sure that they've gone into the police station and the fire station and, met all the first responders in town so that folks know exactly who they are, both in case something challenging were to happen, but also so that the community is sort of taking ownership and responsibility and wanting to support this individual. And again, that they're a popular member of the community who is then going to be more safe, more supported, have more integrated opportunities. So that's something to focus on and kind of build up from an early age. And then don't forget to plan ahead for transportation. If you can't get there, you can't have it. So we don't want to build amazing employment skills for working in a particular employment setting, but not have a way for the student to reliably get there in post-secondary adult life. If that's driving, there are a lot of steps to managing that process. It may require adaptive driving, assessment or instruction. Public transportation can be critical and sort of making sure that we have a sense of the geographic limitations associated with whatever public transportation is being used. And then certainly if students are using, door-to-door paratransit kind of transportation, there are still skills required for using that transportation. So even students who are going to have an incredibly high level of support in adulthood still also have a really high number of skills that they have to be able to carry out for safety, for success, and for quality of life. So just being thoughtful about that. And don't forget technology. Technology is my favorite way to replace people. And I don't mean that in terms of, sort of replacing jobs, right? Replacing the things that people have been accommodating for the student while they're in school. And really trying to find ways for that student to function more competently. So it can be specialized technology and more general kinds of technology. Obviously alarm clocks are huge, and there's a wide variety of alarm clocks when one isn't working for a student, electronic reminders, location-based reminders, learning to use cell phone and text messages and things like dropping a pin on your location and being able to send that to somebody else, right? That's such a useful safety skill. Emailing appropriately, other computer skills. It's been really interesting supporting students when schools went remote and realizing that, there's a lot of organizational and planning kinds of skills that have to do with computers. And I think young people have technology in their hands a lot, but we may not have taught them how to effectively and efficiently use all the programs on their computers that are required for different adulting activities. Certainly video conferencing and chat is something we're using more and more, and there's ways that can be great, social media, smartwatches. I love smartwatches for learning more about coping and self-regulation, right? And also setting better fitness habits or other things like that. There's just so many different examples of ways that technology can support a student in, being able to be more competent with different skills. And there is frequently an app for that when we're trying to learn something. So I'm going to just shift and see if there's any questions at this point.
So feel free to write any questions you have in the Q&A. And then also we have a question about if we're starting late in the process, sort of where do we go? Where do we start? What do we do?
Yeah, so if we're starting, I mean, again, you have to just always start from where you're at. And so it really doesn't look that different from when I was showing that sort of life cycle, right? Of wherever we're starting from, the first thing we need to figure out is what do we know about our goals for post-secondary life? And so that could be 1 year in the future, 5 years in the future, 10 years in the future. It's useful to know if those goals are different, right? If there's different short-term or long-term planning goals. If you don't know the answers to that, right? If I don't know what I'm trying to plan for in terms of education and employment and independent living and community engagement, then you know you need to be doing some level of evaluation. But the other thing is, if you know what you're planning for, but you're not sure sort of where you're starting from in terms of various areas of skill set, then you also might need to do some assessment, right? So the process kind of always looks the same in terms of trying to figure out what the goals are, trying to figure out what the strengths and needs and preferences are in relation to those goals, and then obviously prioritizing. And I do, I prioritize things like, and this is going to be so different for every student, but communication, right? So if a student has limited intelligibility or limited verbal skills for being able to advocate for themselves, boy, do I want to work on that while we have a lot of support, right? While we have speech language support. So I want to make sure that students have the ability to self-advocate to community members. I want to make sure students have the ability to retell events from their day accurately in some way, shape, or form. I mean, I think about a lot of different safety skills. If you, even a student who is going to live in a residentially supported housing in adulthood has to be able to exit in the case of a fire relatively independently. So there's a lot to think about in terms of like your basic foundational communication and self-advocacy and safety skills, if those haven't been developed. And as I said, transportation and travel and how a student's going to get places is also really critical. And even just looking at, like look through your IEP or look through the documentation that you have right now and make sure that that's accurately reflecting the student's needs right now. There are a whole bunch of accommodations still written in there that the student's not using. Like, let's get rid of those. Then let's look at whatever's left and prioritize. So I think there's those are some ideas, but certainly, where to start would be even more student specific, depending on what skills that student has developed and what skills they haven't developed. If there hasn't been a really good assessment of activities of daily living, so self-care skills, health and safety skills, domestic skills, housekeeping skills, and community skills, especially now that we've been in this pandemic. That's an area often to make sure that you've had a thorough assessment of, because I think they're usually surprises, and even just a question that I ask parents when I do consultations, that I ask students when I'm starting an assessment process is like, what responsibilities do you have at home? And then what other responsibilities would you like to have, or would you like your child to have? So certainly there's, I look for things that maybe we haven't paid attention to yet, and anywhere that there's motivation, and that's a good starting point.
We have another one of when should a student start attending IEPs?
Yeah, so there's certainly on a federal level, student voice has to be included in the IEP process. Students have to be invited to the IEP at 16. In Massachusetts, that age is 14, but it actually is that a student has to be invited to the IEP meeting for the IEP that will be in place when the student turns 14 or 16. So we're actually talking about inviting 13-year-olds to their IEP meetings. Now, there are situations where adults may decide that an adult still retains the rights to decide that the student's not going to be there, but then the special education team has to make sure that the student's voice is included in the IEP, and that gets a little messy. So I certainly think we should all be aiming to have the student be invited at 13, if not earlier. It's also because the only way to have a truly student-centered process is to figure out how to include students in the process. So if we're having a hard time figuring that out at 13, that's not just going to get better on its own. Certainly, as I had shown that graduated IEP process, we can have a student, be invited for a portion of the meeting, or we can work with a student ahead of time so they can prepare something to present at the meeting. If a student's not ready to be part of a team meeting process with a 12-person team, they could meet with the liaison and with a teacher or the parent and preferred educator before the meeting to provide input. So there's a lot of different ways to include that student voice, but it's required once we start talking about transition services. So once we're at the IEP when the student turns 14.
And then who do you recommend helping to learn those transportation skills that you talked about?
So I'm obviously more familiar with resources that are local. So the interesting thing is that the MBTA, Mass Bay Transit Authority, does have system-wide orientations for individuals with disabilities, and does actually have a Ways to Go program where they offer travel training for students. So that's really helpful for students who are thinking about learning to use the MBTA. If students are needing to learn other travel skills, and that, navigating the hallways, navigating the parking lot, navigating the community, there are certainly some professionals who are more qualified to provide that. Travel training can be, and often is, a specialty for occupational therapists. So some of the occupational therapists in school environments may have some experience with that. It's interesting, it often doesn't fit neatly into the school year per se. So I see a lot of school districts maybe kind of bundle that into summer services. But the occupational therapist is often person most likely to have training if anybody in a district is going to have that training. And there are other OTs in the community who do, again, travel training. Some do those adaptive driving assessments, which is a different form of sort of travel assessment and training. And then, as I said, the MBTA does have their own service. We also at NESCA have a good number of occupational therapists on staff, 2 full-time transition specialists, and then several part-time. And we do travel training, and we've worked with school districts on that before too, when they had sort of a cohort of students that they wanted to, say, specifically train on a local transit or some other kinds of travel skills.
Great. Any other questions out there?
Oh, something I didn't mention, Jane, let me just toggle backwards. NESCA does have a blog, and I will say, obviously there's certain things I'm knowledgeable about in this field, and at the same time, I absolutely love reading the blogs that my colleagues write. Every single clinician on our staff contributes to the blog. It comes out on Monday, and there's just always something really interesting and useful to learn. And as I said, we have, if transition is an area you're trying to learn more about, there are 5 of us that blog on transition at various different times. But again, there's all sorts of different blogs around, how to make the most about summer, or different types of diagnoses and how those present. So I would strongly recommend subscribing to the blog if you're looking to sort of learn more information about transition or about any other areas.
Great. I don't see any other questions right now. Certainly, if you have any questions, feel free to follow up with me, and I will get you the right answer from Kelly. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. And again, this will be, the recording of the webinar will be up on our website at www.nesca-newton.com. And it will be under the resources tab. So look for that there. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks everyone for paying attention and for good questions.
All right, take care.